Welcome to a special edition of the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mackowski, and joining me from the great state of Tennessee is my friend Curt Fields. Curt, how are you today?
I'm fine, Mr. McCaskey. How are you this day?
I'm doing wonderful. Thank you. Curt and I have been having this really cool ongoing project where Curt's writing a biography of Ulysses S. Grant for the Emerging Civil War series. And this series of conversations is the basis of that book. And so today, Curt will be presenting as Ulysses S. Grant, talking about the post-war years and Reconstruction and Grant's relationship with President Andrew Johnson, which, as we will discover, will become pretty fraught. So, Curt, thanks for being with us today.
It's good to be here. It's a privilege to talk history with friends.
So, well, it's always a privilege to talk history with you as well, my friend. So, I'm going to ask you to put your general's hat on, proverbially, and ask General Grant, first of all, thank you for being with us today, General Grant. And tell me a little bit about your relationship with President Johnson.
My relationship with President Johnson started out fairly, indeed, very well, but then it quickly disintegrated from there. And I should begin with the surrender at Lee for a little bit of background. General Lee surrendered on April the 9th, and I gave him the terms of if you'll lay down your arms and never take them up again against the United States, and return to your homes and obey the laws in force where you live, then you will not be disturbed by the United States government. Now, there are those, particularly now since President Johnson has been in office after President Lincoln was murdered. I do not use the term assassinated. It's too clinical and distant. President Lincoln was savagely murdered. But now that he is out of the picture, the surrender terms that I gave Lee have been called in by some into question, saying that I did not have the authority to do that, that it was too sweeping. However, it has been sustained. Now, the surrender was consummated, and then or rather General Sherman was in North Carolina with Joe Johnston. When Johnston heard of the surrender, he immediately began to talk seriously about surrendering. He knew the war was over. Sherman had initially assured me he'd give Johnston the same terms that I gave Lee. When his paperwork came in, when Major Hitchcock brought his paperwork into the Washington City, Sherman had agreed in sweeping changes to, for example, no real surrender of the Confederate forces would go back to their respective state capitals and stack their arms in armories. The existing state governments would become the state governments, which and go forth, and that would essentially solidify the Confederacy only with the United States again. And nothing was said about slavery, but the way the surrender with Johnston was initially proposed, slavery would have stayed in effect. So that caused some consternation with myself and President Johnson and Secretary of War Stanton. And then I opted to go to North Carolina, met with Sherman, and told him, you've got to give Johnston the same terms that I gave Lee, which he did. And as I recall, April the 26th, Johnston surrendered to those same conditions. But in the interim, Stanton had leaked an article to the newspapers calling Sherman a traitor and other scurrilous names that simply was not necessary and outraged me. I said, for Sherman to be the patriot that he has been and to be used in this manner is outrageous. But President Johnson began to flex his authority a bit, and in fact, directed Judge Robert Underwood of the Southern District Federal Court in Virginia to indict Lee. And he also he began what has become known as presidential reconstruction with the Lee indictment. He issued, while Congress was out of session, an amnesty decree that had 14 different exemptions, and it would have been relatively easy for a Confederate soldier to get amnesty and regain his citizens' rights, except the upper crust of Southern society and all of the Confederate officer corps. And they had to come and appeal individually for amnesty, and which hundreds of them did. Johnson actually bit off more than he wanted to chew with that, because he ultimately granted hundreds, if not thousands, of personally granted amnesty decrees to different Confederate and Southern leaders. But he was cautioned not to do that while Congress was out of session. But he issued the amnesty, and that he wanted the South to rejoin the Union. He felt, like President Lincoln, that the seceding states had never really seceded. He said that we don't need Reconstruction, we just need rejoining, and that there was a constitutional issue there about whether the states had ever really left. And Johnson said we don't need Reconstruction, but he wanted to make the traitors howl. He said treason should be made odious. And he wanted to have the South reinstated with the yeomanry, as he said, running the governments and the political situation. And because he had a real bad attitude, angry attitude toward the aristocracy of the South. He'd grown up poor. North Carolina, ran away to Greenville, Tennessee, Eastern Tennessee, and became a tailor. His wife taught him how to read and write after he was 21 years old. And he had a real aggravation for the upper crust and the aristocracy of the South. He didn't want them back in control. That's ultimately what happened, though. But he wanted, in his presidential reconstruction, everything would be as it was before the war, and the same people would be running the southern states, all 10 of the states in question. Tennessee had gone back in first early. So we were dealing with 10 Confederate states that had been in rebellion and were still not part of the Union. And that's when Johnson began to get at cross purposes with Congress. The radical Republicans wanted to punish the South, and indeed to make treason odious, but they wanted to put the heel on the neck of the conquered and completely reorganize the South. They saw it as an opportunity to completely reset the Union, and were determined to punish the South. And they and Johnson got further and further apart. Johnson ordered at the end of April Judge Underwood to indict Lee, and they indicted Lee, I think Longstreet, I think Jubal Early was named, et al., Legal Talk for and others. And Lee wrote me a letter that said I was coming into Richmond to apply for amnesty, and I got information that I've been indicted by a federal court. What is this? Well, I endorsed his appeal for amnesty and sent it on to the Secretary of War, Stanton, and to go to the president. And I told General Lee that I was unaware of this, but this was not going to happen. I'd look into the matter. And I went to the president and asked him what was going on. And he said, well, they need to be punished. And I said, we can't do this because I've got a treaty with him, an agreement with him. And he had, in fact, told Judge Underwood, and Judge Underwood told the federal grand jury that when the question was raised by a friend of the court, what about the treaty that General Grant had negotiated the surrender with General Lee? And it was dismissed as a military treaty that has no bearing on the civilian issue. No bearing. the president and the federal judge completely dismissed the surrender terms that I had negotiated with General Lee that averted guerrilla warfare. Everybody went home, even though Jefferson Davis had advocated guerrilla warfare. General Lee said, no, we will not do this. These men will have no supervision, and it will be blood upon blood. So that treaty that sent all Southern soldiers home, nobody went to prison from Lee right on down. Nobody was punished, just stopped the killing. That was dismissed with a wave of the judicial hand that it has no bearing. It's a military agreement that has no bearing on a civilian issue. When there was a lot of constitutional concern about, well, is this a military issue or is it a civilian issue? Because indeed, the treaty was military. He's being tried or he's being indicted by a federal civilian grand jury. So I told the president and the cabinet, but I told the president, this has got to stop. And he said, well, when can we pursue this with General Lee? And I said, never. You can never pursue this. And I further told him that you politicians may do whatever it is that you do for whatever reasons that you do them. But I'm a soldier, and I gave General Lee my word as a soldier in that surrender that they would not be prosecuted after the fact. And General Lee accepted that. Indeed, Mr. President, if he had known, if I had told him, you're all going to be put in prison, you're all going to be tried for treason and hanged, he would never have surrendered. So you need to know that you're about to start the war again, because indeed it was already being rumbled in the press. If they're completely doing away with their side of the agreement, then we need to do away with our side of the agreement. In the vernacular, all bets are off, Yankee. We're going at it again in guerrilla warfare. And I warned the president, you're about to explode a powder keg here if you pursue this matter. And he said, well, I indicated I wanted to do that. And I told him, if you do not drop this matter, I will resign my commission in the United States Army. I put my career and my life on his desk and said, either stop this madness or I will resign. And only then did he back away, and he ordered Attorney General Joshua Speed to quash the indictments. But I will tell you that I found out later, after I was elected president, that those indictments were indeed completely quashed only days before I took the oath of office. But I don't know if General Lee ever knew what I did. It doesn't matter. It's a matter of principle that Johnson was going to, and Congress was going to honor the treaty that we agreed on, that President Lincoln and the Congress had agreed on at that time, and not go back after the fact. So President Johnson and I began to part ways as early as less than a month, by June 16th of the 20th, when all this debacle went on with General Lee. We had already begun to part ways. Now, the other issues that were going on, I sent John Schofield and 50,000 troops to the Rio Grande, the Texas border, because Maximilian was in Mexico. Now, we need to look at the larger picture here. Not only is the war ending and various Confederate forces in the field surrendering, which they quickly did, but I advocated that we invade Mexico and defeat Napoleon III, represented by Maximilian of Austria, who's a puppet president in Mexico. Now, Secretary Seward said, no, we don't need to do that. President Johnson was ambivalent, but I told him, if you don't go into Mexico now and fight what we need to do now, while we've got 50,000 troops on the border with able leadership, you're going to have to fight a much bloodier and longer war with France later. So minimize your costs and invade Mexico. Now, I was adamant about going into Mexico, but Seward was opposed to it. President Johnson was not enthusiastic about it, if not opposed to it. And we didn't go into Mexico. Ultimately, at the beginning of 1866, Napoleon III backed out. Maximilian was caught and executed, and that threat was over. It turned out that Seward was right about what he was saying. I think I would have been right had we gone in, but a diplomatic or a non-involvement on the part of the United States was the better path for us to have taken. Well, also at that time, about that time in August, President Johnson came out with the decree that all of the lands that had been lost or abandoned during the war would be returned to their white owners. They could come back and reclaim them. Well, that caused a furor because of the 40 acres and a mule. General Sherman off the coast of Georgia, not long after the war, had said something in one of his orders about 40 acres and a mule and the redistribution of land to former slaves. And President Johnson, and again, there was a constitutional question: can you do that? Is that constitutional? But Johnson returned all of the lost lands to anybody who had abandoned a plantation or any property. The blacks that had moved on to the property, indeed, some started farming. They had to move off the property, and it was returned to the original owner. And that did not sit well with Congress at all. The radical Republicans were feeling stronger. They felt like in the 66 elections, they might be able to retake Congress. And the rift between Johnson and Congress was widening. And again, Johnson, I think, made a mistake by issuing amnesty statements and conditions while Congress was not in session. That politically hurt him. But in July, the president sent former General Carl Schurz, a German immigrant, St. Louis, now resident. He sent General Carl Schurz on an inspection tour of the South. And Schurz was down there for about 3 weeks. And he came back and he wrote, I think, a 40-page report, which was devastating about the conditions in the South after the war, with how blacks were being treated, the economic conditions for everybody, black and white, and how devastated the South was. Well, that wasn't the news that President Johnson wanted to hear. So he, in November, sent me on a tour of the South, and it was a goodwill tour. I went down there as Lieutenant General Grant. I went to Tennessee and Georgia, Virginia, South Carolina, and I talked to a number of people, but they all told me everything was rosy, the situation was good, the newly freed blacks are happy, the economy is flourishing. And I came back and reported that to the president. Now, he sent my report and Schurz's report both to Congress, but he heavily emphasized mine. Well, I came to realize after the fact that I had been shined, as they say down there. I went as General Grant, and I just talked to people who were in leadership positions, and it occurred to me not too long after the fact. I'm proud to say, but I'm ashamed to say, I got the shine, and I gave a report that was far too optimistic. It really didn't tell the story as it should have been told. Carl Schurz's report told the story, and I later told General Schurz, "You were right, and I was wrong. I'm ashamed that I turned in the report that I did. I was duped in that tour." But that's what President Johnson was looking for. He wanted to have a positive outlook on what his administration was doing with the Reconstruction, or the rejoining, I think, as he liked to phrase it. And then on December the 13th, we had some good news. the 13th Amendment was officially ratified and slavery was officially dead. So we ended the year of 1866 with the end of slavery. Well, now, when we went into 1866, the next year, of course, Napoleon III leaves Mexico, as I said a moment ago, and that threat on our southern border was over, although I think we should have invaded Mexico while we could. Canada also had some concerns that we were going to invade Canada, but we assured them, and they saw we don't have any interest in Canada. Now, the Fenians, some Irish undercover scurrilous folks, were going across the border into Canada and trying to start a fight, hoping that we would come in and get into a fight with Canada and then take it over. But I stopped that too from my position as General in Chief. We stopped the Fenians, and Congress passed the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau. I think it's the Freedmen's Bureau and Unclaimed Lands. It had a long title. And the Civil Rights Act, which had guaranteed some rights and citizenship privileges to newly freed blacks. Remember, we've got 4 million newly freed slaves. President Johnson promptly vetoed them. And in fact, he's a constitutional scholar student. People don't like him. I indeed don't care for him, but he's astute and knowledgeable about the Constitution. And he raised the question that the Civil Rights Bill was a violation of states' rights, that the federal government was impinging, overreaching their legal authority with the Constitution. And that's a question for scholars. I am not such a constitutional scholar, but I lift that up. Those were questions raised. And he vetoed the Freedmen's Bill and the Civil Rights Bill, and they were promptly passed over his veto. I, at that time, also recommended that the Bureau of Indian Affairs be put under the auspices and control of the War Department. At the moment, that was taken note of, but no action was taken. And on May the 1st, we got disturbing, or after May the 1st, disturbing news of riots, race riots in Memphis. I understand some 48 blacks were killed, 80 to 100 were injured. There's really no telling how many people were injured, really no telling how many people were actually killed. But some savage race riots broke out in Memphis. And that was it wasn't the beginning of my awareness of the problem. It was the beginning of realizing how serious, how deep the problem was, with Memphis police officers at the time, indeed, leading the riots and being instrumental in how they ran, and Memphis officials taking no action. And I reported that to the cabinet. I was going to cabinet meetings as the general in chief, not as a political, I want to emphasize that, not as a political participant, but only to give views and advice on military affairs. I am not a politician. Well, also about that time, on a personal note, I asked the president to recommend my son Fred to the United States Military Academy, which he did. And Fred, when it was time, a few weeks later, went off to the academy. He was actually 4 inches taller than I was when I went in. I was 5'1". Fred's 5'5", and a little bigger than I was. When I entered the academy, I was 5'1" and weighed 117 pounds. But a bright note, personal note for myself, Fred was the president himself, recommended my son to go to the academy. In June, the 14th Amendment was introduced into Congress, and that caused some consternation on the part of President Johnson. He again argued that it was a violation of states' rights. and that we were getting into territory where we constitutionally should not be, that those matters should be left up to the states. But the 14th Amendment was introduced, and President Johnson promptly began preaching against it. And then something that I did that I'm surprised was not taken more note of. I advocated, and it was accepted, amnesty for deserting federal soldiers. Just come on home, turn yourself in, and that's the end of the matter. And that was held open until August the 15th. As you can well imagine, that sparked some aggravation and some bitterness about that. With their deserters, they need to be executed. And my feeling was the war is over. We're trying to heal the country. This is a matter that can be easily solved. And while it causes angst on the part of some individuals, it will cause joy, pleasure, if not indeed joy, on the part of many, many more. Come on home. All will be dismissed. Turn yourself in. And then we had the New Orleans riots that went for about 3 days. Many more people killed in New Orleans than there were in Memphis. They were trying to it started with a constitutional type of meeting with some trade unions, primarily Black trade unions, and individuals in the New Orleans area leadership did not like that and provoked a riot. And we didn't do at all that we could have done to stop that. And I've worked on that ever since. But the New Orleans riots again indicated how deep the problem was and how serious it was. On July the 25th of 66, I'm pleased to say that I was promoted to the rank of General of the Army. It was a newly created rank, but I would like to point out, I do not want to diminish the luster of the stars. I've been teased by my friends that I look like I have a veritable galaxy of stars on my shoulders. But I just smile and let that go. The duck back water issue, let it roll off. But the president wanted to court my favor for the support of his Reconstruction. And Congress, radical Republicans, also wanted to court my favor to support their programs. So I'm in the nexus between these two philosophical approaches to how we bring the country back together, both of which I thought were not bringing the country back together, but driving it further apart. However, both sides wanted to court my favor and felt that I deserved a higher rank, and I became the first 4-star general of the Army. I was very pleased and carried on and didn't let it go to my head. The stars stayed on my shoulders. They didn't go to my head. Now, at this time, though, the president's relationship with Congress is getting so bad, it's so acrimonious. And President Johnson, I thought, was becoming erratic. And I quietly ordered in the summer of 66 that all the stores that possibly could be moved to be moved out of military arsenals in the South. In fact, I wrote in confidence to General Sheridan, I can discuss it now, that I'm gravely concerned that the president is in fact going to declare the Congress, because we've got midterm elections coming up in the fall, that the president is going to declare Congress null and void and appoint or try to seat his own Congress. And I know that sounds extreme, but I was feeling he was that extreme and might do that. So I moved arsenals, supplies, military supplies out of the South so they would not be available to the Southern states. Then he wanted to send me on a diplomatic mission to Mexico, and I didn't want to go. I knew that what he was wanting to do was to get me out of Washington and out of the way where I wouldn't be going to cabinet meetings, where I would not be in the center, what would be the vortex of the storm that he was inadvertently and indeed intentionally developing. He wanted me out of the country. And I told him I didn't want to go. He said, well, I want you to go. And I told him I didn't want to go. The third time we were at a cabinet meeting, and he said that he wanted me to go to Mexico. And I said, I'm not going. I will not go. And he turned to the Attorney General. Joshua Speed by that time was gone. But he turned to the Attorney General and he said, is there any reason why General Grant should not obey my orders? And the Attorney General started to speak, and I stood up and angrily said, there's no need for him to answer that question. I will answer the question. I am a general of the Army, and I will follow to the letter and the spirit any and every order that you give me, Mr. President, that is a military order. But this order that you are trying to give me is not military. It is a civilian political mission. I have no expertise in civilian matters nor in political matters. I have no business going to Mexico on the role, on the mission you are trying to order me to go, and I will not go. And then I turned and looked squarely at him and I said, no power on earth can make me go to Mexico. And I got up and walked out and left the cabinet meeting. I understand that the president backed away from that issue after I had left and let the matter drop, and they moved on to other matters. I had also walked out of an earlier cabinet meeting. I'd like to say this. They began talking about political matters, and I said, I'm here in a military capacity. I don't think I should be here once I've given my report and answered the questions that you have of me regarding military matters. My usefulness is done. I think I should leave. And the president said, no, I'd like you to stay. And I arose and I said, no, sir, I'm not a political person. I'm a military person, and I have no business sitting in cabinet meetings discussing political matters. And I beg your leave, and I left. And then I went back and I wrote him a long letter explaining my position about politics and political stances. And he called me in and he pointed out to me, he said, I wasn't wise in the way, I'm not wise in the ways of politics. And he said, you left the cabinet meeting. And he was civil, he was kind. I'd like to point out to you, though, you left the cabinet meeting and you say you didn't want to be involved in politics. Yet he held up my letter. You've written me a lengthy letter that is nothing but politics. And I knew he had me. I had blundered and extracted myself, not just excused myself from political matters, and then went back and in the heat of the moment, not in temper, but in the heat and the passion of the moment, I wrote a lengthy letter stating my political position, and I played right into his hands. But thereafter, I did not stay. Once I made my reports and answered questions, I would leave cabinet meetings. But I did not go to Mexico. He called Sherman from St. Louis and said, come to Washington, and told Sherman, I want you to be the interim general-in-chief. I'm going to send Grant to Mexico. And Sherman, of course, when he came from St. Louis, he immediately came to my home with Julia and I, told me what was going on. And I said, don't do it. And he told the president, I will not go in lieu of General Grant for the purposes you have in mind. But that was resolved in President Johnson letting himself off a hook that he had crafted and sharpened for himself by my refusing to go. And Sherman said, if you really want me to go, I'll go. If you want somebody there, I will go to Mexico. And he did in my stead. And I stayed in Washington City. I was not going to go. Well, then the midterm elections are held, and the Republicans swept Congress, solid majority in both houses. So now they've got the power to block anything the president wants to do, and they can initiate legislation that the president doesn't want to do, and the fight was on. So then we moved from President Johnson's presidential reconstruction to the congressional reconstruction, and the flames got higher. Early in 67, I recommended to put, and we put Texas under martial law. The state of Texas was rampant with violence, violations on blacks, and we had to put Texas under martial law. And again, I recommended early in 67, let's put the Bureau of Indian Affairs under the War Department. And still no notice was taken. But on the same day, in January, as I recall, Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act. Now, anybody in Washington City, everybody in Washington City knew the purpose behind the Tenure of Office Act. But as I understand, and again, I emphasize I'm not a political person, but as I understand, the implications of the Tenure of Office Act are long range and tilt the axis of our government. To be sure, the cabinet, they've got to be approved by the Senate appointees, but that's going in. But cabinet members are supposed to serve at the will and pleasure of the president. And when he feels that their services are no longer needed for whatever reason, he will accept their resignation. Now, the center of this particular vortex is Edwin Stanton. And he and the president are at cross purposes. In fact, they're two cross-cut saws cutting against each other by now. And he wanted to get rid of Stanton. Stanton didn't want to go anywhere. The radical Republicans want Stanton in as Secretary of War, and they know that Johnson is going to try to replace him. So they passed the Tenure of Office Act. Now, that would tilt the basis of our government by, instead of the presidency being totally independent, the legislative, the judicial, and the executive all being equal power and independent. If the Tenure of Office Act held, then Congress has got the president in a chokehold. They control who's in his cabinet. Once somebody's in, they don't get out unless Congress approves it. That takes away the power of the president. It restricts the president's authority and maneuverability. And the founding fathers did not put that in the Constitution. It didn't need to be in the Constitution. Now, that's my understanding, and I can see that argument. But it was meant to keep Edwin M. Stanton in as Secretary of the War. Well, right after that, immediately after that, Congress passed the first Reconstruction, what became known as Reconstruction Acts. They passed three. Early in March, I think March the 4th or 5th, they passed the Reconstruction Act, and that divided the South into 5 military districts with generals commanding the military districts with authority over the civilian governments. And that was the first significant step of the radical Republicans wanting to control the South and dominate the South. Then a couple of weeks later, they passed the second Reconstruction Act, and that let the commanding officers in those 5 districts control the elections or monitor the elections and how the elections were conducted, which extended their authority in the election process, where they could overrule civilian authorities. And then later on, well, in June, Maximilian is executed in Mexico. The Juarista government executed him, and Napoleon left him hanging to dry in the wind. And back in France, the Juaristas captured Maximilian. He's executed. The threat to French intervention in the Western Hemisphere is over and done with. Right after that, Congress passed the third Congressional Reconstruction Act, which allowed them to monitor election personnel, supervise elections, and replace civilian officials if they saw fit. So the 3 Reconstruction Acts had the South under some tight control. Military districts with soldiers to back up the civilian authorities, or indeed act where civilian authorities refused to act, which was more often the case. In fact, I directed the commanding officers in those districts, you move in when you see that civilian authorities are not taking action on criminals, particularly the violations against blacks or white Republicans down there, then you step in and act, put those people in jail until the civilian authorities do act. So we had to step in, and I used that military control in a manner I don't think the radical Republicans anticipate. I know they didn't anticipate me using us at the Army to control civilian criminal activities, but I was not and am not comfortable. The military has no business enforcing civilian laws. We are separate, but we had to step in because of the atrocities being committed against blacks and white Republicans who were helping blacks to try to establish a new life. Right after that, in August, President Johnson did replace Stanton. He told me he was going to do it. He told Stanton he was going to do it. And on August the 11th, I was named the interim Secretary of War. I talked with Stanton before, I talked with Stanton after it, and told him my position. And I told the president, there's controversy involved here, and I'm not going to get caught in the middle if I can. I have been desperately now for 2 years since the war is over. We're into August of 67 now. Since April of 65, I've been trying to stay in the middle between Congress and President Johnson. And I'm not being successful. And I told the president, I told Secretary Stanton, I'll do this job until the Senate works out what they are going to do. I told Secretary Stanton, essentially, I'm going to keep the seat warm until they work this out. But the moment that the Senate has some kind of a resolution on this, I will step aside. Well, that goes on back and forth for a while. And I want to, again, I'm going to cabinet meetings as the interim Secretary of War. But I'm also, once I give my report or answer questions, I leave the cabinet meetings. I don't want to be in a cabinet meeting any longer than I have to. And once they start discussing politics, I excuse myself. In November of that year, Alabama held a constitutional convention, because in all of this reconstruction, every state has got to rewrite their constitution, eliminate slavery, accept the 13th and the 14th Amendments, because it's working through its ratification process. They've got to accept both of those and have a constitution that will be accepted, approved by Congress. Alabama holds the first one in November of 67. Everybody was nearly everybody was very pleased with that. And then in December of 67, Johnson again asked Congress to approve Stanton's removal. Well, that's hitting a hornet's nest with a short stick. The outrage was on. President Johnson just would not let it go. And all the time, I'm getting further and further away. Congress is getting further and further away. And everybody's thinking about that debacle, that the swing around the circle that was held last year or in 66, August and September of 66, when Johnson went on a tour, a 3-week, 2,000-mile tour in the Northeast, Chicago, New York, Buffalo, New York, Kentucky, St. Louis, and it was a disaster. He got into verbal arguments with people and hecklers in the crowd. He would say things like, people would say, well, you're going to hang Jeff Davis, who was in prison at Fort Monroe. And President Johnson said, well, you know, we could hang people like Thad Stevens or Charles Sumner as well for all this reconstruction going on. One traitor at each end of the rope is good as a traitor at the other end of the rope. And I'm sitting there thinking, what are you saying? Everybody is aghast. He's saying things in public speaking events with hundreds of people there. Well, Thad and Stevens and Charles Sumner at one end of the rope is as good as Jeff Davis at the other end. They're all traitors. I was writing Julia letters and saying, I can't stand this. And finally, after that debacle at St. Louis, I went home. I said, I'm sick. I'm going home. What it was is I was sick of President Johnson. But I went home and got out of the circle around, swing around the circle. But that, I would think, if you wanted to point to any particular instance that was the doom of Johnson's presidency, it would be the swing around the circle in August and September of 66, or the Secretary of War. Well, in
Did
68,
he want you to go with him just to lend your personal prestige?
yes, he had Dan Ammon, Admiral Dan Ammon, and myself, and he would put us on the stage, and I would be at his right hand and Admiral Ammon would be at his left, and he would say, look, see, I have with me the Navy with a grandiloquent gesture to Admiral Ammon, and the Army and a grandiloquent gesture to me. Admiral Ammon and General Grant. The implication being that we supported his Reconstruction program. Neither one of us wanted to be there, but the General-in-Chief, Commander-in-Chief, had ordered us to be there. So he felt that obviously our presence would lend credibility to his programs, which needed no credibility. They were incredulous. Well, going into 1868, as if things aren't bad enough, on January, I think it's January the 11th, a Senate committee reports back that the Tenure of Office Act was legal. Now, there was that constitutional question that many people aren't aware of that I want to lift up. It said the Tenure of Office Act began with President Johnson. Well, if you will remember, Stanton was appointed by Lincoln. President Johnson did not appoint Stanton. So was the Tenure of Office Act retroactive? It did not say so. If it didn't say so, a strict interpretation, if it didn't say so, it ain't there, as the people in the halls of Congress would say. So not only was there a constitutional question, can you restrict the president dismissing a cabinet member? The Senate has control over who the president's got on his contract, both coming in and going out. Now think about that. With the Tenure of Office Act, the United States Senate controlled who was on the president's cabinet. That cannot be. Approval, yes. Be sure there are qualified people on in a cabinet position, but to control who gets on and who gets out, that's unacceptable. However, the Senate committee reported back it's legitimate. So on January the 13th, the Senate passed a resolution that said the president has to reinstate Secretary of War. Well, at that juncture, I had heard what the bill provided for punishment. Well, the Tenure of Office Act provided for punishment for those who obstructed it, a $10,000 fine and up to 5 years in federal prison. I immediately went to President Johnson and said, I'm stepping down. I don't have that money and I can't do the time. Johnson laughed and said, I'll pay your fine. I thought, well, you're not saying anything about doing the time. But I immediately went the next day to the War Department and I locked the inner door, I locked the outer door, and I gave the keys to the Adjutant General. And I went back, I said, I'll be at my office in Army headquarters. And I went back to my headquarters and spent the rest of the day there, not to be Secretary of War again. Stanton, within the hour, was back in the office and enjoying holding court. He barricaded himself in the office. He's quite the character. Well, the president then called me to a cabinet meeting. And I went to the cabinet meeting. And the president began to keel haul me in that cabinet meeting, berate me, insult me. I listened to it for a few minutes. And then I stood up and said, I'll not listen to this, and walked out of the cabinet meeting. And I walked out. Then I wrote him a long letter, another letter, and I essentially called him a coward, a liar, and a lawbreaker. So we can say in January of 1868, any relationship between President Johnson and myself was sadly non-existent. Acrimony, it wasn't political matrimony, it was military political acrimony as of January of 1868. Then in February, I had sent Hancock to Superb to be the military governor over New Orleans. And they've got liberty, to be sure, but he had replaced 9 members of the New Orleans City Council on grounds that they felt unreasonable, and so did I, and I ordered them to replace them. He didn't. Later, I ordered them to replace them, and I replaced them. I overruled Hancock and put 9 city councilmen back on the New Orleans City Council. And February the 21st, Johnson did it again. He fired, this is the 3rd time, he fired Stanton again. Now, he appears to be somebody who wants to throw coal oil on a blazing fire. But he, again, February the 21st, says remove Stanton. February the 24th, he was impeached. And 11 counts had to do with the Tenure of Office Act, as I recall. Now, he ultimately was acquitted. He was impeached. He was not convicted. And I should like to emphasize there's a big difference. Impeachment is merely charges being brought against you and a trial is held in the Senate. He was not convicted. Of course, he was a lame duck by then in every sense of the word, but he was acquitted by 1 vote. A senator from Kansas voted against him being impeached. And then about that time, I also urged Congress to reinstate James Longstreet, all of his political privileges and citizenship privileges, which they did. On May the 21st, in Crosby Opera House in Chicago, with 8,000 people there, 650 delegates, Black Jack Logan, General Logan, the most successful political general out of the 178 that Lincoln appointed, put my name in nomination for the National Union Republican Party. And I'm pleased to say that all 650 delegates voted. One ballot, one vote, unanimous. I was nominated to be the banner bearer for the National Union Republican Party for the election coming in November. And Skylar Colfax, the tanner from South Bend, Indiana, shoemaker, I think, from South Bend, Indiana, was nominated to be my vice president. I promptly took a 2-week tour out west on the Great Plains, took my son Buck, who had never seen the Great Plains. Indeed, I'd never seen the Great Plains. Sheridan was there. Other people were there. John Rawlins was there. I think, as I recall, a Russian Archduke was there. 2-week tour, went all the way to Denver, had a large time, huge time, shooting buffalo out the train window, shooting antelopes out the train window, had a hunting party on rails. And then I went back to Galena and stayed there until the election. And on November the 3rd of 1868, well, on October 5th, I went to Springfield, Illinois, and laid the cornerstone for the new State House in Springfield. And then I promptly returned to Galena. I'm not a speech maker. I wasn't going to be a speech maker. There were plenty of people who liked to make speeches that were campaigning for me. And I stayed, they said I conducted a front porch campaign. And on November the 3rd, I was elected president, carried all but 8 states. Horatio Seymour was my opponent and defeated him. I got, as I recall, 231 electoral college votes. And as of the night of November the 3rd, going into the early morning hours of November the 4th, 1868, I was elected the 18th president of the United States. I went home I was at Hugh Washburn's home, my congressman there. He'd had a temporary telegraph wired to his home. And I went home and told Julia, Mother, it seems I have been elected the president. And we promptly went to bed. So as of my election as president in November of 68, we'll have to see what the future brings with my new foray into new territory, and let me learn the ins and outs of the political world. We'll have to see what the future brings.
General Grant, what was it like when you became the candidate for the opposition party while Johnson's still in office? What sort of kind of tension did that create to an already tense situation?
It just added fuel to the fire. It was acrimonious. President Johnson would not speak to me unless he had to. I did my job and he did his, and both of us would do whatever we could to avoid being with the other. And those times when we had to be with the other, we were at least civil, not friendly, but civil to one another. It was an uncomfortable situation for both of us.
Well, General Grant, soon to be President Grant, let me congratulate you on your election. And I wish you all the best as you delve into the political arena. I hope all goes smoothly for you.
Let us have peace.
Indeed. General Grant, as portrayed by Curt Fields here in the Emerging Civil War podcast, I'm Chris Mackowski. Thanks so much for being with us. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.